So first up, these slides are linked to in my latest tweet. It's twitter.com/Ronnie Burt. And, definitely feel free to DM me there with questions. We got questions here if you're watching us live, or find me in the WPCampus Slack community at any time. I am a big nerd, love to talk about this stuff. So what kind of stuff are we talking about? I'll start with a little bit of an overview of just my personal opinions and background on the state of privacy. So I'm coming at this as, I work for a company called InkSub. I've been there for over 10 years now. InkSub has 3 different services: Campus Press, EduBlogs, and WPMU Dev. And I'm the Chief Business Officer of InkSub. And in that role, a couple of years ago, when GDPR was rolling out and everyone was getting all anxious and excited, basically none of us, we looked around in the company. We knew we had some work to do. We knew we needed to, we were always following really good privacy practices, but we needed to solidify those. We needed to write those down. We needed to be transparent about them to our customers. And so that's when I really started digging in, reading a ton, taking some online courses. I'm by no means, a privacy attorney or privacy expert, but I do love to learn and talk about this stuff and share the information that I have picked up over the years, especially here as it relates to the education organizations, schools, universities that we work with. So for starters, when it comes to privacy, if you haven't noticed, there are so many laws. There's obviously the big one in the world, even though it's mostly related with the European Union, GDPR, that we've all heard about, that has impacted all of us. If nothing else, all of the services that we subscribe to let us know about their privacy policies a little bit more clearly. A year and a half ago, whenever that was, a year ago. Those of us that work in the education space, any sort of privacy breach, any sort of privacy issue is totally headline worthy, front page news, especially locally, but really, nationally, internationally. That's not a story you want to be part of. Experiencing some sort of data breach of the students or the staff at a university or school. Privacy Shield there put a big line through that because about 2 weeks ago, I think, I woke up in the morning and started scrolling through Twitter to see that Privacy Shield has been struck down, null and void, by the highest court in the European Union. It was kind of expected, but Privacy Shield was a framework of that about 5,000 companies in the US, including ours. We sent off our privacy policies and practices and self-certified that we were following all sorts of different guidelines and practices when it comes to data protection so that we could process data of those from Europe. So now that Privacy Shield, ironically, the very day after our company re-self-certified, including several $1,000s in lovely fees that we won't get back, was stricken down, null and void. That being said, Privacy Shield, the US government saying still around, companies can still subscribe so that the FTC can still hold us accountable. So we'll stick around for that, and we don't know what's coming. And one interesting caveat, just to not totally bore you to death, but you would think that maybe all of this was about like you and your personal data and what it means for the consumer. But the reason that the Privacy Shield was struck down was concerns around the US government surveillance of European citizens and data. And so it was really all about national security, that there's reasonable concern around I'm here in the US, our government being able to access data of European citizens. And that's the reason that the Privacy Shield was struck down as it is. But companies can still process, and organizations, educational organizations can still process, house, contain or hold data on folks in Europe. It's just we got to use something else besides Privacy Shield, contractual clauses, and there's all sorts of instruments we can go through. But I would prefer the conversation was more around us and an individual and national security. There's also some interesting research that when it's housed in the US, it may be surveilled less than if it was housed out of the US by other governments, but that's a whole different talk. I also, when it gets back to WordPress, I lurk around in the Make Core Privacy WordPress Slack channel, and there's been a lot of interesting talk really in the last month. This came from a few weeks ago from Matt Mullenweg, co-founder of WordPress, hugely instrumental in the future of WordPress project. And I won't read the quote to you, but at first, if you just read the quote out of context, I encourage everyone to go into the Slack channel, read the full transcript, we'll provide whatever. But the fear here is that, WordPress core, first of all, Matt asserts we can't reasonably accommodate all of the different countries in the world and within the US. Every state has their own law around privacy. Like WordPress just can't handle it all. And I think a lot of us that were following the conversation were a little concerned there at first, but then I got to thinking that maybe this isn't as limiting as it sounds. Maybe there still are things that maybe we don't accommodate specific regulations, specific countries, but we just need to make sure that WordPress core, but then also plugins, WordPress sites that we're hosting or that we're working on are following best privacy practices. So how do we do that? Well, I'm a big believer that compliance creates minimum standards. It's true in accessibility, all sorts of areas. If we set some standard for compliance, then everyone's just going to meet that minimum standard, when instead the goal should be to be as privacy conscious as possible, to be as accessible as possible, or whatever it may be. So I think, if we don't need to leave it that WordPress is just not going to handle privacy because it's too confusing, too much to deal with. We can say that maybe WordPress itself, WordPress core, but also all of us as in the WordPress community, those of us running, managing, building, designing, developing WordPress sites, we can implement and follow best privacy practices. So what does that look like? One of the terms that's thrown around a lot in the privacy world, you'll hear talked about in any privacy talk you may ever listen to, is privacy by design. So privacy by design is a construct, I believe it was Canadian data privacy organization, province in Canada, I can't remember which, a while back. They came up with seven topics or guidelines in terms of privacy by design. There's lots of talks, lots of information about this that you can look at, but what it really means, I think it makes sense once you think about it, is you're not going to bolt on privacy after the fact. From the very beginning, when we design a new website, when we build a new site, or when we're working on a new plugin or feature, we need to be privacy conscious from the beginning. Privacy must be default setting, so it's not something you're not going to assume that a user has consent. It needs to be transparent and open, and it also needs to respect and really be user-centric. So it's, we got to keep the user in mind in all cases. So this is very high-level theoretical. Lots of folks will talk about it at a high level much better than me, but it's a good place for us to start, and it's also a good place for us to take back all conversations that we have when it comes to privacy. So from that conversation around what is WordPress core's responsibility with privacy, we can go back to privacy by design. When it comes to our individual WordPress sites that we're running and working with in our day-to-day jobs, we need to come back to these core tenets of privacy by design. Another term that you'll hear a ton is a risk-based approach. And so this is the idea that what's good enough for your situation may not be good enough for mine, or vice versa. It's also, I would normally say that this would give you kind of an okay or an out, not to stress about everything, because I'm going to go through a ton of lists or a ton of areas of concern and things that we need to be aware of, and it's going to be a little overwhelming and we can't get to them all. If we take the risk-based approach, if nothing else, this will help us prioritize what we need to look at first, what are going to be those big wins. However, something that is growing very apparent to me as we work with customers and we are asked to fill out endless vendor questionnaires and work with security teams and review teams and privacy reviews in terms of service reviews, all that sort of good stuff, is basically what we're seeing, especially the larger organization, is the risk-based approach. Everything becomes high risk. So, for example, just yesterday I was reading through some guidelines from a customer in a large state school in California. And it starts out nice. How are we going to classify data? Because I was kind of looking through the site. What kind of data does the WordPress sites that we're hosting have to kind of categorize them? And it starts out great. We're not hosting health data, HIPAA data. We're not hosting learning records, learning data. Great. Nothing of concern. And then it gets to the very last bullet. It was any personal information. So that little checkbox at the very end means that because in the WordPress database, when you create any WordPress user, that user has an email address that's attached to them. And we are using single sign-on and authentication so that users are created with their institution email address. That's deemed personal. All of a sudden, we go into the third, the highest risk category, which these websites are pretty low level, not the main university sites. It's like faculty sites and student organizations, important sites, good things like that, but are being treated basically to the same standard as the employee records database and the student management of all student grades and transcripts and how we're paying employees. You got to basically are put into the same category for what kind of security measures are in place to protect that data because of that email address that's associated with the user, which pretty much means everything's personal. But it is a worthwhile conversation to talk about really, we have the usual identifiers of what's personal information and your names. Every state law, if your state has a law or if your country has a law, most of them will try to be specific around what's personal. For example, like in Arizona, it's first initial last name or anything more than that would be personal, but not just first name, not just last name. Email addresses, definitely usual identifiers of like social security or numbers or driver's license numbers or any government issued number. Geolocation data, that's often in the European Union and elsewhere, that includes IP address. So that means like every visitor and your web logs and your server logs and any email notifications that include the IP address, it's listed in the comments inside the WordPress dashboard. Biometric data, probably not super relevant, but I could see the day where, there's a plugin for thumbprint scan to log into WordPress or something. Biometric data. The browsing history is included, so that's definitely relevant to us if we're keeping track, if we're using tools to know where users coming from, if we are seeing what pages they're visiting on our websites and keeping track of that and identifying or tying it to some other identifier so we can reasonably figure out who that person was. That's personal information. Psychometric, the big most recent law in the US that really is impacting all of the US is the latest California CCPA law identifies psychometric data as personal. So I often have to look up psychometric, but it's any psychological data. So if you have quizzes, surveys, Any learning records, so kind of takes it further than in the US, we're used to FERPA. And one that I find really intriguing and interesting is inferences are considered personal data. So what would an inference be? If you are using geolocation data to show different content on a page when someone arrives based on geolocation data or based on where they came from. So if they came from a certain social media campaign and you're showing them something different and you're able to store that record in some tool that you're using to know who that person was and why you made that inference, and that's also part of the personal information record. So we could debate and go on. People, talk about what's personal all the time, and it very much depends on the law, and it does get complicated. For any WordPress site that you are a part of, working on, developing, building, hosting, it's a good idea, if you're not already doing it, to regularly do some sort of complete data audit. It's no fun. It's just as fun as it sounds. I have a list here of a few areas that you want to consider and think about when you're doing this complete data audit. Depending on the site, right? This is a risk-based approach. For your main marketing landing pages and sites, you're going to want to do a more in-depth data audit that's more formal, and you're going to want to keep these records that you're doing this in a more formal way, down to a smaller subsection site, maybe kind of in an ad hoc, just evidence that you did it is fine. But what information does your host collect on users, including IP addresses or weblogs? Are there any email lists that you're collecting data from on your website? Is it integrating or connected with any marketing or CRM tools? Does your site display cookies? And almost certainly does, with a few exceptions. What are those cookies collected? Does it include personally identifying data? Do you have any contact forms or other ways of collecting user data on any of the sites that you're working on? Are there any notification emails being sent out from your system or from your site that might include personal data? So that could be someone sends a form, or then that form sends out a notification email. That could be contact, most of us don't have comments on anymore because we're tired of them, but comment notifications out of WordPress would include personally identifying information sent via emails. All sorts of different plugins that may have notification or system emails. Do you have any analytics tools in place? You almost certainly do. Are you collecting, or hopefully not storing, but collecting or some way facilitating any payments? How's that working? Where's that data stored? What does that look like? So I don't have like a specific formal example of what this could look like. If it's a larger site and you're a large organization, you probably have a formal process, but you want to be part of it, I would say, part of the process instead of like someone else coming in basically and doing it, so that or do a pre-audit before it gets done formally if it's a really large organization and site. How do you do this audit? If it's a smaller, simpler site, like we all have friends there, because we're the WordPress experts, that we get asked to like look at their site or work on it or whatever it is that we do on the side. Or these are just kind of my three go-to before I work on any site or do anything. I just want to know what's going on under the hood. For me, these work. Just builtwith.com often tell you different plugins or different services that it integrates with. Chrome Inspector, you can look at the sources and cookies tab and see different scripts that are running, different integrations, the cookies that are there. Just a simple cookieserve.com scan will only do the home page. Kind of a funny-ish, interesting story, I suppose, on cookies. When we were getting ready for our GDPR goodness on WPMU Dev, one of the things, we used a different service to scan our entire domain for all cookies. and I mean, it came back with hundreds and hundreds of cookies across our site. Started digging into it. It was because we have a blog that's almost 15 years old. It's got probably 10,000-ish blog posts published over those years. Anytime anyone, any author, writer on those posts happened to embed something from a different service, more often than not, some cookie got added to that load of that blog post. So, it became a good report for us to use to see what kind of old stale content we could repurpose or clean up or delete, because we've wanted to, and we declare every cookie that we serve and what its purpose is and why. So when you start embedding from around the web, that list gets really long really quick. Another big term, phrase, honestly, this slide, it's gray and boring, but is really perhaps the most important slide. If you just take one thing from today's talk and you go back and you think about it and you think about what you can do, is data minimization. So it takes doing the audit first, really, but if you know what your site's doing, think about really hard what kind of data your site's collecting, and do you really need that data? Are you really using that data? If you're not, then just get rid of it. It's, there's no reason to have it laying around. I have this debate pretty frequently with our internal growth marketing teams that love to run different services and store long-term data that, so we can run nice reports. I mean, I'm a data math nerd too, but it's not, we're going to just go fishing through old data to see if we can learn something from it. Realistically, that's not something we're going to do too often, or if it does, the data is probably old and stale anyway. For example, we were running for a while on different sites some heat mapping tools just to collect heat map and runtime of how folks were trafficking around different sites, and they were really just kind of running in the background, and we kind of moved on from the project, and no one was really looking at those results. They were just there collecting lots of data. Not only was it slowing down our websites, but we realistically were not going to go back and use it, so we needed to just get rid of it. Whatever you are going to keep, is there any way that you can anonymize what you're keeping? Is it really important that you have that full name or email address or username attached to that record? Can you get rid of it? Can you delete it? Can you hash it? Even though hash may still be your personal data, that's better than having it kind of in clear text in the original form. So what can you anonymize? Google Analytics is an example. There are some settings. I don't have the specifics on how to set it up, but we can talk if you need it, or do some research on making sure that if you've got all the settings correct in Google Analytics for anonymizing all that traffic, because unless you really need and have a purpose and are disclosing and having your visitors opt in to collecting that data in a non-anonymized way. Then for whatever data you're keeping, it's just always good to think about how long do you really need it. I was going through some of our old sites, and we had some contact forms on there. We did some contests years ago in the K-12 education space, and that data was just sitting in there from 5, 6, 7 years ago, and there was no reason for it to be laying around that someone could access at some point down the road, maliciously or not. We aren't going to use it, so we needed to just get rid of it. And so there's not like any hard and set rules, it needs to be deleted after 6 months or whatever. It depends on the risk. It depends on the situation, if you're actually using it or if you have a purpose for it. You really can't have a talk about privacy without talking about security, because you could follow all the best privacy practices, but then have some big security holes and your data gets stolen, taken, used, or whatever it is. I won't go too into depth here, because I think At this point, for this crowd here, we're all pretty well informed in this area, but keeping things up to date. We'll talk a little caveat about up to date. Usually you'll hear always just stay on the latest version, always just stay on the latest version. And I totally understand that and appreciate that. If you're one of our customers, I know that that's something that we've had to have a lot of conversations around. We don't always like to update everything like in the middle of a crazy time of year during back, school's coming back into session or whatever it is. Can we just do a security patch? Yeah, I mean, and not like a full update. WordPress core actually will do security updates to old versions if you know where to look as an example. That being said, I mean, we're also striving to be as up to date as possible, because it just becomes when you start adding many plugins to the list, that just becomes a lot harder to juggle. We're all familiar with SSL, encrypted in transit, but you will see not all hosts are set up, or definitely not by default, for encrypting your WordPress instance at rest. So if that's possible, we need to enable that. Just good best practice. It used to be a lot harder. It used to be more performance implication, but now it's something that we should all strive for. Definitely in how we manage users through single sign-on, at least two-factor or multi-factor authentication. Depending on your site and your need, if you need a security plugin, there's a bunch out there. We have one. There's a ton of others. It depends on your site's need, what other security measures are in place. If a security plugin is needed, I would say that you don't need a security plugin just for the sake of having a security plugin and crossing that box off. It depends on how your site's set up and what it is that you're doing. It is becoming more commonplace to have some sort of web application firewall or WAF in place. And so that would be beyond a traditional firewall of just IP blocking. Web application firewall is monitoring traffic in real time and looking for different signatures, different ways of knowing that it is potentially malicious traffic, and blocking it before it gets into your WordPress site. There's 3 different types of WAFs. There's the network WAF, or that's above your server somewhere in the chain. So like Cloudflare paid WAF, where DNS runs through that. The WAF is implemented, and then traffic, if it's okay, is sent to your server or your servers or your cluster for your WordPress sites. You have them on the server side, but before it gets to WordPress, and then you can have them in some of the security plugins that are out there. So then they're sort of living within WordPress, and usually that comes with a performance hit, but is definitely better than nothing. You definitely need to have backups in place. This isn't new news, but I do want to point out 2 things because this isn't always the case. This is less and less of an issue, though, that we'll have to not talk about so much going forward. But making sure those backups are encrypted, and then also making sure that those backups are not just stored right along in the same server as your WordPress site. You want them somewhere else, so that they can be more useful should something happen to that server. You'd be surprised when we do migrations of sites, especially individual smaller sites. They might be coming from some cPanel instance or something, which is all great and fine, but not set up originally with encrypted backups or backups off-site. And some of the backup plugins and stuff might just put them right back in the WordPress, right on the same server. So the good news for those of us that work in WordPress, work with our WordPress websites, is that when you read the news, when you look through the data that's out there on schools and universities that are hacked, that have some sort of privacy issue, the website is not, that common of a problem in the chain. The most common, from what I've seen, my experience, has to do with emails through phishing campaigns, or just some other way that someone has gotten into an employee or a student's email account especially on the employee faculty side. This is why we all take, annual security trainings about identifying phishing attempts. And but what's is relevant here from your WordPress site perspective is I talked about contact forms, and I'll talk about them a little bit more too. But if you're sending a CSV file of data of all of your users on your WordPress site or from a contact form, and that's an attachment, when these folks are gaining access to an email account, they're looking for attachments. They're looking for CSV files, PDFs, or whatever it may be that has sensitive data. And that's a very common thing that you'll see of where attacks happen. So if we cannot send those files as attachments and maybe put them in a Dropbox that has a link that expires in the email or something like that, that will protect us long term, because that attachment could have been sent 2 years in the past and is still living in the email archive. And so that is just something to be aware of. Another potentially interesting story, scary story to be honest, is, I want to say it was about a year ago, we got an email from a client that was pretty urgent help ticket. They were worried their site had been hacked, is what they said to us. So our team immediately goes on alert. That is not a very common occurrence. And we start digging into it. And what we found is it was a WordPress multi-site network, that sites had been created on the multi-site network that were written all in Arabic, that luckily the content, once we could translate it, was looked like just marketing spam for shoes and athletic apparel or something like that, with a lot of good links back to different websites and stores. But clearly, at first we were like, well, maybe there's some student trying to run some side business. Can we look into that? Then, while we were looking a few hours later, we got another email from another client that saying basically the same thing. We're like, ooh, okay, so this is a little bit more serious, not just a one-off thing. So start digging around. We noticed some kind of common threads in the content that they look similar. Start working with the security and identity management teams of those customers, and they start researching those user accounts. It turns out that they were valid. We could look through the logs. They were valid user accounts, valid user logins. They had authenticated through Shibboleth, I think, in all cases. And so it wasn't a hack directly, in that there was no hole or backdoor in some plugin that was rogue or something. Someone had legitimately logged in, created these sites, and started adding this content. So then we started looking through Google, and we find dozens and dozens of other university WordPress sites that were on WordPress multi-site networks that were not our customers, the exact same thing. So we start putting a list of those together, start reaching out to those folks. They're not our customers, saying, we discovered this content, we're seeing the same thing, you want to at least take it down. We get to the bottom of it. Everyone is in agreement that these user accounts were purchased, illegally on the dark web, that were valid student accounts of credentials that had somehow been obtained. And some enterprise somewhere had thought it was a good idea, probably because there's at least a belief out there that .edu domains are really good for SEO. So they would start just adding a bunch of marketing links and try to build up this store. Eventually got it all cleaned up. It wasn't a true hack in the WordPress sense, but it gets back to emails. So long rambling story. The other thing when it comes to forms is to think about, if you're collecting data in forms, not to call another customer out, sorry, about this, but we have one that's moving to us, and just practice that we really should avoid going forward is on their main university website. They had built at some point in the past, using a popular WordPress form plugin, their entire HR application for recruitment for people that wanted to apply for faculty jobs at the university. And this form was asking for file uploads of transcripts of those potential faculty members asking for copies of, all sorts of sensitive data, driver's license or passport copies, all sorts of good stuff. And it was going right into the WP content files folder, right there next to all of their live assets for their images and stuff that's on the website, basically. So you kind of ask yourself, is WordPress, which is designed to be is built for public content and public information, the best place to house this sort of sensitive data? I think if you have a fully private WordPress site or fully private multi-site, and you got all the right security stuff in place, fine. That's different than putting it right on your main web presence install. So you got to really think about that. Look at your forms. What are they collecting? And is WordPress really the safest and best place for that data? There are some services or different tools out there, brand new. Also, can see a story about it in my Twitter from today, but FortressDB is a new service that's integrating with multiple WordPress forms to basically offload that data and from different forms and also an API so that it's not stored in the WordPress database, it's at least stored elsewhere, because you really shouldn't have your marketing folks on the web team have access to all that HR data. Only the HR folks should. That's a big privacy practice of least restrictive, least have the fewest people have access as possible. And then again, we've already talked about if that form is sending out email notifications and attachments. Just briefly, another thing we do see when you're doing design is just on getting consent. All you site designers are probably getting really well versed in this, but when you are collecting any data, it needs to always be opt-in. So as simple as the checkbox cannot be checked before, for someone, they need to actually physically check the checkbox on any sort of consent. It needs to be friendly. You can't just ask and consent for like 100 things all in one sentence. It needs to be like multiple, broken apart if necessary. And you don't want to just ask for consent for everything and always in the future all at once. Only when you're actually collecting that data, that's when you should ask for consent in real time. Getting back to WordPress, there is some tools very much hidden under settings privacy. There you will find some default privacy policy text and language from the WordPress team. I don't recommend actually that those of us, our businesses, schools, organizations, your university privacy policy doesn't need to come from this template from WordPress. But buried in there is a little link about some language that plugin providers can add information about possible data that their plugins are collecting and possible third parties that the plugin would integrate with. And so it is hidden in there, and I can try to provide some better links and examples of what's there, but definitely check that out and encourage any plugin providers that you work with to start adding the necessary stuff if they're not already there, and just kind of working through, because it's a big goal of mine to make it more obvious and more upfront for all of us to discover what plugin providers are collecting and what integrations they may have. Another new tool that you may not know about is data and deletion requests. So this is under tools. It's about to work better in multi-site, I think, in the next update. I need to check, but where someone can request a copy of all the data that WordPress has collected. And so that would be posts and comment data, but also plugins can hook into this, and is a really cool tool. And there you can not just get a copy of it, but you can also delete and anonymize using this tool. So hopefully more and more plugins will also start integrating with this tool. As we go forward, I can see in some implementations, this is a requirement in the latest California law. I think eventually we're all going to be required to always be able to provide our students that we work with, faculty or whatever, what data as an organization we have on someone. And we need to have easy ways to do that because it's not easy. Also, there's a team working hard and have been for a long time on a new consent API that plugin authors can hook into to have a standard way of collecting consent and storing consent in a log of that consent, but also doing things like not showing or not running an analytic script until someone has opted into it in a standard way. It was proposed back in April as a featured plugin that would then eventually be rolled into WordPress core. I don't know that the reception has been as good as maybe I had hoped and as others had hoped in terms of getting that ball rolling quickly, but the plugin is there and is usable, and I know different plugin authors are starting to take it on as a standard, so if nothing else, it could be used there, or if you're working on a project that needs consent, I would definitely check that out. And then you can also read up on the privacy core. Privacy team is a subgroup of the core team and what their ideas are around what WordPress core could do and make progress there. So lots of good stuff. You may have noticed a few puns in the slides. I cannot take any credit for any of that. That's from our marketing team in our 2 or 3 times a week newsletter, The Whip. And I cannot take any credit for any of the graphics either. Also our design team from the WPMU Dev blog. So I definitely, just a minute or two maybe, but can stick around and love to hear things.
Awesome. Hello again. Yeah, we don't have too much time, so maybe we'll answer one, and then if you have some time later, you can hop on the website and and answer any more of them. But someone asked, what does encrypted at rest mean?
So encrypted at rest is on the server level, your WordPress installation, your database being encrypted there. So if someone downloaded or got in and downloaded a copy of that database, they wouldn't be able to open it. So you can see that also you can encrypt just the file uploads, different levels of what that can mean.
Oh, okay.
Some of that technicality might be just slightly over my head.
Let's see, we do have time, I think, for the one more question, so we can cover them all as I watch the seconds tick by. How does one implement good privacy practices with, say, Google Analytics or Facebook business pages? And do you have links to resources to improve our awareness and workflows in regards to respecting user privacy?
Yes, good questions. I don't have much experience with Facebook pages, but we did some work around Google Analytics. We'll see what I can put together. And I know there are different posts and stuff that I've read, and we'll try to share those and put them together in a list and answer them on the question here.